The road twisted and turned through the mountains, hugging the steep cliffs that overlooked the valley far below. The sun was sinking behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the winding asphalt. Michael, an experienced bus driver, kept both hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He had driven this route countless times, but the sharp bends and unpredictable weather always kept him on edge. Inside the bus, the passengers were settled into their seats, each lost in their own world. Some were tourists, gazing out the windows at the breathtaking view. Others were locals, dozing off or mindlessly scrolling through their phones. A few whispered conversations drifted through the cabin, but for the most part, it was quiet. Then, something struck the windshield. It was quick, a blur of black against the glass, followed by a sharp thud. Michael barely had time to react before the object tumbled out of sight beneath the wheels. A few gasps came from the front rows. "A bird," someone murmured. Michael frowned, his grip on the wheel tightening. It wasn't the first time an animal had crossed paths with his bus. But there was something unsettling about the way it had happened. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but the road behind was empty. Then, another impact, and another. Thud, thud. Something was wrong. A dark shape streaked past the windshield, followed by another. The sky, which had been a clear orange moments ago, now seemed filled with movement. Michael squinted through the glass, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Birds, hundreds of them. A passenger near the window gasped, "Oh my God, look at that." The murmurs spread through the cabin as more passengers took notice. Outside, a dense flock of birds was gathering, swirling like a storm cloud above the road ahead. Their wings beat frantically, a chaotic blur of black against the fading sunlight. Michael's stomach clenched. He had seen flocks of birds before, but never like this, never moving with such intensity, such purpose. Then, without warning, they dove. The first wave hit the bus like a hailstorm. Wings, beaks, and bodies slammed into the windshield, the roof, the sides of the bus. The sound was deafening, a relentless barrage of thuds and scrapes. The wipers struggled against the mass of feathers and blood smearing the glass. Passengers screamed. Michael fought to keep control, his arms locked, his foot easing off the gas as the road ahead became a blur. The headlights barely cut through the living storm outside. The birds weren't just flying randomly, they were attacking. "Why are they doing this?" someone shouted. A loud crack split through the chaos. One of the side windows fractured, a web of cracks spreading across the glass. The birds outside shrieked, their cries a mixture of rage and desperation. They weren't stopping. If anything, they were growing more aggressive. Michael knew he couldn't keep driving like this. He scanned the roadside, searching desperately for a safe place to pull over. A small clearing appeared up ahead, a narrow patch of land just wide enough for the bus. It wasn't ideal, but he had no choice. With careful precision, he turned the wheel and guided the bus off the road. The tires crunched over gravel as the vehicle lurched to a stop. But the birds didn't leave. They swarmed around the bus in a frenzy, their bodies slamming against the metal, their talons scratching at the windows. The passengers inside sat frozen, their faces pale with fear. And then, the lights inside the bus flickered, and the nightmare continued. Inside the bus, the flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the passengers' terrified faces. The rhythmic pounding of wings against the windows had not ceased. If anything, the birds had become more frenzied, their screeches filling the air like a deafening choir of madness. Michael sat rigid in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had parked the bus as safely as possible, but now they were trapped. A middle-aged man in a business suit stumbled down the aisle, his voice shaking. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "Why aren't they leaving?" Michael didn't have an answer. The birds pressed against the windows, their dark eyes peering in. They weren't simply panicked creatures acting out of confusion. They were coordinated, relentless, almost calculated. Then, another crack. The fractured side window gave way. Shards of glass rained down onto the seats as a gust of wings and beaks burst into the cabin. A woman screamed as several birds flapped wildly through the confined space, their claws scraping against the upholstery. Passengers ducked, shielding their faces as the creatures whipped past them. Michael shot up from his seat. "Get down," he shouted. A young man near the broken window swatted at the birds. his hands flailing. One of them latched onto his sleeve, its sharp talons tearing through the fabric. He shrieked, shaking his arm violently until the bird released its grip and tumbled to the floor. Twitching, more birds forced their way in. People scrambled over the seats, desperately trying to move away from the chaos. The bus had become a battlefield. Feathers, broken glass, and panicked screams filled the air. Then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the cabin. The only illumination came from the dim glow of the dashboard and the eerie red emergency light above the exit. For a brief moment, everything was silent. And then, bam! Something heavy slammed against the roof. Michael barely had time to process it before the entire bus shuddered. The metal above him groaned as if something, or many things, were moving across it. "What is that?" someone whispered. Michael didn't know, but his instincts screamed at him, "We can't stay here." He turned to the passengers. His voice firm despite the fear gripping his chest. "We need to get out of the bus. Now." A man near the back scoffed. "Out there? Are you insane?" Michael didn't have time to argue. He reached for the radio. But it was dead. No signal. No backup. They were on their own. With no other choice, he pushed toward the door and gritted his teeth. He would have to open it. Outside, the birds weren't just circling anymore. They had landed. Hundreds of them lined the road, their dark forms barely visible in the fading light. They perched on guardrails, clung to tree branches, and covered the ground like a living carpet. Waiting, Michael hesitated, his hand hovering over the door release lever. And then, for the first time since the attack began, the birds stopped moving, every single one of them. They sat motionless, their beady eyes locked onto the bus. The silence was suffocating. A single crow, larger than the rest, stood directly in front of the headlights. It tilted its head, almost examining the vehicle. A lump formed in Michael's throat. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The bus was trapped in an unnatural silence. The birds remained frozen, their glossy black feathers barely shifting in the wind. The large crow standing in front of the headlights seemed almost expectant, its sharp beak slightly open, as if waiting for something. Michael's breathing was slow and deliberate. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to keep the doors locked. But staying put was no longer an option. The broken window was proof of that. If more birds broke in, they wouldn't be able to fight them off. He exhaled sharply and reached for the emergency hammer. "We're getting out," he announced, his voice firm. "Stay low, stay quiet, and move fast." Some passengers hesitated. The businessman from earlier scoffed. "You expect us to run into that?" He gestured to the sea of motionless birds outside. Michael didn't have time for an argument. "Yes," he snapped, "unless you'd rather sit here and wait for them to finish breaking in." That shut him up. With a deep breath, Michael raised the hammer and slammed it against the emergency exit window. The glass shattered instantly, the shards falling to the ground outside with a sharp tinkle. The passengers tensed. The birds didn't move. Heart pounding, Michael climbed through the opening, landing softly on the damp asphalt. The cool mountain air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. The moment his foot touched the ground, the large crow cawed once. And then, in unison, the birds turned their heads toward him. A wave of nausea rolled over him. The way they moved, so precise, so synchronized, it wasn't natural. But they didn't attack. They just watched. Michael turned back toward the bus. "Come on," he urged, one at a time. A young woman, trembling, hesitated before gripping the edge of the window and climbing through. She landed beside him, her breath ragged. One by one, the passengers followed, carefully stepping onto the road. Still, the birds did not move. The moment the last person exited, the air seemed to thicken, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then, the crow cawed again, and all hell broke loose. 1,000 wings erupted into motion at once. The deafening sound of flapping feathers drowned out the passengers' screams as the birds launched themselves into the air. The sky darkened as they swirled overhead, forming a massive, twisting vortex. Michael grabbed the young woman's wrist and ran. "Go!" The passengers bolted. Some sprinted toward the tree line. Others stumbled down the road, desperate to escape the chaos. Then came the first attack. A man near the back screamed as a bird sank its talons into his shoulder. Dragging him backward, he fell, clawing at his attacker. But more birds swarmed him. Michael spun around. "Help him." A few brave passengers lunged forward, grabbing at the man's arms, yanking him free. Blood streamed down his sleeve. But he was alive. Michael turned back toward the road. His only thought was get away. But then, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Through the churning mass of birds, just beyond the bus, a figure stood at the edge of the trees. A person, still, watching. And then, as if the figure had given a silent command, the birds turned again, this time, toward Michael, and they attacked. Michael barely had time to react before the birds struck. A wall of feathers and claws slammed into him, knocking him backward. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his ribs. Talons raked his arms, his face, tearing at his clothes. He threw up his hands, trying to shield himself, but the weight of the birds pressing down on him was suffocating. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard screaming, his own. The passengers, the piercing cries of the birds. The world became a blur of black wings and flashing beaks. Then, just as suddenly as the attack had begun, it stopped. Michael gasped for air, barely able to comprehend what had happened. The birds lifted off him, their wings stirring the dust on the road as they retreated. His body ached, his skin stung where their claws had raked him. But he was alive. He forced himself onto his hands and knees, blinking through the pain. Around him, the other passengers had scattered, panting, their eyes wide with shock and terror. Some had scratches, others were still trying to process what had happened. And then he saw it again. The figure in the trees. Closer now. Michael's stomach twisted. It was a man, tall, dressed in dark clothes, standing at the edge of the tree line. His face was obscured by the shadows. But Michael could feel his gaze. The birds weren't attacking him. They were waiting. Michael's breath came faster. He wiped the blood from his forehead and forced himself to stand. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice hoarse. The man didn't respond. Then, he lifted a hand. And the birds moved. Michael barely had time to react before the entire swarm launched toward him again. "Run," he bellowed, spinning around. The passengers needed no further instruction. They bolted, their fear driving them forward. Some scrambled down the road. Others dashed into the trees, desperate for any escape. Michael followed, his legs burning as he pushed himself forward. The sound of beating wings filled his ears, drowning out everything else. He didn't look back. He didn't dare look back. The forest swallowed them whole. And the birds followed. Branches whipped against Michael's face as he tore through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was thick, the trees closing in around them like a suffocating cage. The sound of beating wings followed close behind, growing louder with every passing second. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The birds were still coming. A swirling, writhing mass of black, moving unnaturally in perfect synchronization. They weren't just chasing them, they were hurting them. Michael's stomach clenched. This wasn't random. This was planned. Somewhere ahead, a woman screamed. Michael turned just in time to see one of the passengers, a young man in a red jacket, stumble over a fallen branch. He hit the ground hard, panic flashing across his face as he tried to push himself up. The birds descended. Michael lunged forward, grabbing the man by the arm and yanking him to his feet. "Move," he shouted. The man staggered but ran. The birds swarmed the empty space where he had fallen, their sharp talons sinking into the dirt, beaks snapping at the air. That could have been him. The realization sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through Michael's veins. He pressed on, his legs burning as he forced himself to keep running. Then, up ahead, the trees thinned. A clearing. Hope flickered in his chest. If they could just. A wall of birds slammed down in front of them. Michael skidded to a stop, barely avoiding crashing into the swarm. The others stumbled behind him, panting, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. The birds hovered, their wings beating furiously, their black eyes fixed on them. They were trapped. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. And then, a voice. Low, cold, almost inhuman. "You should not have run." Michael's breath hitched. Slowly, he turned. The man was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, his dark figure barely visible in the shadows. Michael could finally see his face now, sharp features, pale skin, and eyes that were as black as the birds themselves. The moment their gazes met, a shiver ran down Michael's spine. This wasn't just some ordinary man. This was something else. Something wrong. The birds shifted, their bodies trembling in anticipation. Waiting for his command. Michael's mind raced. They had to get out of here. Now. But how? And who was this man? Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. The presence of the man, his eerie calm, the way the birds responded to him, set off every alarm in Michael's mind. The man took a slow step forward. The birds, as if tethered to him by invisible strings, adjusted their formation in sync with his movements. "You shouldn't have run," the man repeated, his voice as steady as before. Michael swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to act. But what could he do? The man wasn't armed. But the birds, there were thousands of them. A few of the passengers huddled closer together, whispering frantically. The man's presence unsettled everyone. But no one dared to speak. Michael forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if the question amused him. "That doesn't matter." Michael's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the man exhaled slowly. "The bag." Confusion flickered across Michael's face. "What bag?" The man's expression didn't change. His gaze swept over the group, stopping on one person, an older woman standing near the back. She clutched a large duffel bag tightly against her chest. Michael followed the man's gaze and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hadn't noticed it before, but the woman had been protective of that bag the entire time. The birds, as if sensing the shift in focus, let out a collective cry. The sound was piercing, almost deafening. Michael turned back to the woman. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his voice firm. The woman shook her head quickly. I don't know what he's talking about." Michael wasn't sure if she was lying, but the fear in her eyes told him there was something more to this. The man took another step forward. "Give it to me," he said, his tone patient but unwavering. Michael positioned himself slightly in front of the woman. "And if we don't?" The man simply looked up. With a single sharp whistle, the birds surged forward. The moment the whistle cut through the air, the birds attacked. A deafening screech filled the mountain pass as wings flapped violently, talons slashing at the air. The passengers screamed and ducked for cover. The birds weren't just swarming anymore, they were striking with precision, aiming for faces, hands, and any exposed skin. Michael threw up an arm to shield his eyes as a sharp beak narrowly missed his cheek. His first instinct was to fight back. But what could he do against this many birds? "Get inside the bus," he shouted. His voice barely carried over the chaos. But a few passengers scrambled toward the bus, arms raised to protect themselves. The woman with the bag hesitated for a split second, too long. A bird dove straight at her, talons outstretched. Michael lunged forward, yanking her away just in time. The bird missed by mere inches, but its momentum knocked the bag from her grasp. It tumbled onto the ground, its zipper slightly undone from the impact. The man took a deliberate step toward it. Michael reacted instantly, diving forward and grabbing the bag first. His fingers closed around the strap just as the man stopped in his tracks. For a moment, neither moved. The birds circled overhead, waiting. The man exhaled slowly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Michael tightened his grip on the bag. "I don't care." The man's eyes flickered with something, annoyance, maybe even amusement. He took another step forward. Michael braced himself. Then, suddenly, bang! A gunshot echoed through the pass. The birds shrieked and scattered in all directions. The man froze. Michael turned sharply. At the edge of the road, just beyond the bus, a uniformed officer stood with his pistol raised. "Everyone stay where you are," the officer commanded. More figures emerged from the tree line, local law enforcement, maybe even wildlife officials. They moved with caution, their weapons drawn, eyes scanning the situation. The man's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed disappointed. The officer took a step closer. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them." For the first time, the man hesitated. Michael's heart pounded. Was this it? Had they finally regained control of the situation? Then, without warning, the man smiled. A cold, calculating smile. He raised his hand, not in surrender, but in a quick, precise motion. Michael's stomach dropped. Another whistle. This one was different. The birds, which had started to disperse, suddenly turned back. The chaos erupted all over again. The air was suddenly alive with chaos. The birds, responding to the second whistle, turned with frightening precision and surged forward again. This time, they seemed even more aggressive, as if the gunshot had enraged them rather than scared them away. The police officers barely had time to react. One officer fired another warning shot into the air, but it did nothing. The birds were too many. Too fast. Fall back, someone shouted. Michael ducked as a crow narrowly missed his face. He grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her toward the bus. Inside, now, the woman stumbled but obeyed. The other passengers, seeing the renewed attack, rushed back into the bus as well. The officers, outnumbered and caught off guard, tried to hold their ground, but it was impossible. The birds were targeting their faces, their weapons, their hands. Within seconds, they were forced to retreat toward their vehicles. Michael threw himself inside the bus, slamming the door shut just as another wave of birds struck the windows. The sound of their beaks hitting the glass was like rapid gunfire. He turned to the driver's seat, heart pounding. "We have to move," he shouted. The driver, a younger man named Luis, gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. "The road, it's too narrow to turn around." Michael clenched his jaw. They had no choice. They couldn't just sit here and wait to be picked apart. "Then go forward," he ordered. Luis hesitated but then threw the bus into gear. The engine roared, and the heavy vehicle lurched forward. Outside, the man still stood in the middle of the road, watching them with that same eerie calm. Michael caught one last glimpse of his face through the windshield. Then, the bus accelerated. The man didn't move. At the very last second, when it seemed the bus might hit him, he whistled again, one sharp, distinct note, and just like that, the birds vanished into the sky. One moment, they were everywhere, pecking, clawing, attacking. The next, they were simply gone. The bus rumbled forward, free of obstruction. Silence filled the space where chaos had been. Michael's breathing was heavy. He turned in his seat, looking out the back window. The man was still standing there, untouched, watching them go, and he was smiling. For a long moment, no one spoke. The bus rumbled forward, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the space. The chaos from earlier had disappeared as suddenly as it had begun. Michael turned to Luis. "How far until we're off this pass?" Luis's grip on the wheel was still tight. 15, maybe 20 kilometers. Michael exhaled. It wasn't far, but on these narrow, winding roads, 20 kilometers could feel like an eternity. Behind him, the passengers were silent, some shaken, others still staring out the windows, as if expecting the birds to return at any moment. Then, a voice broke the silence. "That man," a woman near the front whispered. "Who was he?" Michael had no answer. He had been asking himself the same question. Then, from the back of the bus, a different voice, one that made Michael tense. "I think I know," the man said. It was the same man who had tried to take the bag earlier. Michael turned to face him. The man was sitting calmly, his hands resting on his lap. "You think you know?" Michael repeated, stepping closer. "Explain." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering his next words. Then he sighed. "His name is Leon Mercier." The name meant nothing to Michael, but a few passengers reacted, one even gasped. Michael narrowed his eyes. "And who is Leon Mercier?" The man let out a short laugh. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Michael clenched his jaw. "Try me." The man leaned forward slightly. "He's an animal trafficker," he said, "one of the most notorious in Europe." The bus continued its slow, careful descent down the winding mountain road. Despite the birds being gone, a thick tension remained inside the vehicle. Michael studied the man who had just spoken. "You seem to know a lot about him," Michael said cautiously. "Why?" The man exhaled and leaned back in his seat. "Because I used to work with him." A murmur spread through the passengers. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others stared at him with suspicion. Michael's stomach tightened. "You worked with him?" The man nodded. "A long time ago, before I knew what he really was." Michael crossed his arms. "And what is he?" The man hesitated, then said, "A manipulator. A man who thinks he owns the natural world. He doesn't just smuggle animals, he controls them." Michael frowned. "What do you mean by controls?" The man gestured toward the window. "You saw it yourself. The birds. They obeyed him." A chill ran down Michael's spine. It was true. When Mercier had whistled, the birds had vanished instantly, as if they had been following a command. "How is that possible?" someone asked. The man shook his head. "I don't know exactly, but I know he spent years studying them, learning their calls. Their signals. He always said that animals weren't just creatures, they were tools. He could train them to do things that no one else could. To attack, to distract, to protect." Michael exchanged glances with Luis. "So you're telling me," Michael said slowly, "that he trained those birds to do this?" The man nodded. "Yes, and if he's here, it means he's not done yet." A heavy silence filled the bus. The revelation about Mercier had left everyone unsettled. But there was still one unanswered question. Michael turned toward the elderly woman sitting in the front row. She was clutching her worn-out handbag tightly, her knuckles white from the pressure. The same handbag that Mercier had tried to take from her. Michael cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I think we all need to know, what's in your bag?" The woman's hands trembled slightly, but she held the bag even closer to her chest. "It's nothing," she whispered, but the way her voice wavered told a different story. Luis, still gripping the steering wheel, glanced at Michael. "We don't have time for this," he muttered. "We need to get off this mountain." Michael ignored him. He crouched down in front of the woman, lowering his voice. "Listen, we're not accusing you of anything. But if that man, Mercier, wanted your bag that badly, there must be a reason. And after what we just went through, we need to know the truth." The woman's lips trembled. Her eyes darted around, as if searching for an escape. Then, with a shaky sigh, she unzipped the bag. The passengers leaned in. Inside, wrapped carefully in a soft cloth, was a small wooden box. Michael hesitated. "What's in the box?" The woman hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside was a single, small feather, a deep, iridescent blue, shimmering slightly even in the dim light of the bus. A feather. Michael frowned. "That's it?" The woman exhaled sharply, as if relieved. "Yes." But before Michael could process what that meant, the man who had recognized Mercier suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened as he stared at the feather. "That's not just any feather," he murmured. Michael turned to him. "Then what is it?" The man swallowed hard. "It's from the Spix's macaw." The name rang a distant bell in Michael's mind. Then he realized why. The Spix's macaw was supposed to be extinct. A heavy silence filled the bus as the revelation settled in. Michael turned to the man who had recognized the feather. "You said this was from a Spix's macaw. But that species is extinct, right?" The man nodded slowly. "That's what the world believes. But if this feather is real, then maybe they're not." The elderly woman clutched the box protectively. "I never meant to cause trouble," she said in a trembling voice. "I only wanted to keep it safe." Michael's mind raced. Safe from who? Mercier? The woman hesitated, then nodded. The passengers leaned in, waiting for her to explain. "I live in a small village near the jungle," she began. "Many years ago, there were stories, whispers, about a hidden flock of Spix's macaws. No one had seen them in decades. But sometimes, people would hear their calls in the deep forest." She glanced down at the feather. "Then, one day, I found this. It was near the riverbank. Fresh, as if it had only just fallen. I knew what it was. I knew it was proof." Michael frowned. "And Mercier found out?" The woman exhaled shakily. "Yes, he came to my village a few months ago. Asking questions, offering money. He wanted to know where the birds were. But no one would tell him." Luis muttered under his breath. "Let me guess, he didn't take 'no' for an answer." The woman nodded grimly. "He started sending men into the jungle. Searching. He paid hunters. He bribed officials. And then, a week ago, he came back." Her voice wavered. "He threatened my family. He said that if I didn't give him what I knew, he would burn the forest down to find them himself." Michael clenched his fists. The woman took a deep breath. "So I ran. I took the feather. And I left. I thought if I could get to the city, I could find someone who would listen. Someone who could protect them." Michael exchanged a glance with Luis. "This isn't just about smuggling anymore," Michael said quietly. "If Mercier finds those birds, he'll wipe them out completely. He doesn't just want them, he wants to control them." The man who had recognized Mercier nodded. "And he's ruthless. If he's here, it means he's close. He's not going to stop." Michael looked out the window. The road was still empty, but the tension in the air hadn't disappeared. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a familiar sound echoed through the trees. The sharp, piercing cry of a bird. Michael's breath caught in his throat. That sound, sharp, distinct, was not a random bird call. It was close, too close. Luis heard it too. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. That came from the trees. He muttered, and it wasn't just one bird. The elderly woman paled. They must have followed me, she whispered. Michael's mind raced. Followed her? But why? Before he could ask, a new sound erupted from outside. Wings. Hundreds of them. The swarm was back. The bus shook as a mass of birds descended, their beaks hammering against the metal roof, their claws scraping against the windows. The passengers screamed, shrinking back in fear. Michael turned to Luis. Can you drive through them? Luis gritted his teeth. Not without running some over. And I don't think that's a good idea. The birds were already relentless. Hurting them might make it worse. The man who had identified Mercier grabbed Michael's shoulder. Listen to me, he said urgently. This isn't normal behavior. These birds aren't just attacking randomly. Michael already knew that, but before he could answer, something even stranger happened. From outside the bus, past the thick swarm of wings and feathers, a voice shouted. A man's voice. Michael's stomach dropped. He didn't even need to see him to know who it was. Mercier. The bus was shaking violently now. The sound of beating wings and sharp beaks striking metal was deafening. Michael turned toward the window, trying to get a glimpse of the man outside. Through the chaotic storm of feathers, a figure emerged from the trees. It was Mercier. He stood at the edge of the road, completely calm despite the chaos around him. Open the door, driver, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the frenzy of birds. Luis shot Michael a look. Absolutely not. Michael stepped forward instead, speaking just loud enough for Mercier to hear. What do you want? Mercier smirked. Come now, Michael. I believe you already know the answer. His eyes flicked toward the elderly woman. She has something that belongs to me. The old woman clutched the box tighter. Liar, she spat. These birds don't belong to anyone. Mercier's expression didn't change. I won't ask again. Open the door, and this will all be over quickly. The birds shrieked louder. Their movements were no longer random, they were focused, reacting to Mercier's presence. Michael narrowed his eyes. They weren't attacking him, they were warning him. Michael's mind raced. The birds weren't attacking Mercier. That meant something. Michael, Luis whispered, keeping his eyes locked on the man outside. This guy, something's not right. Michael nodded. Mercier wasn't just demanding the box, he was too confident. He had to be hiding something. Mercier took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. Let's not make this difficult, he said smoothly. All I want is what's mine. The old woman clutched the box tighter. Over my dead body. Mercier sighed, as if disappointed. I was afraid you'd say that. Then, he reached into his coat. Michael's stomach dropped. A weapon? The birds reacted instantly. As soon as Mercier moved, the entire flock surged forward. Hundreds of them, black wings slicing through the air. Talons extended, beaks open, all heading straight for him. Mercier barely had time to react. He stumbled back, raising his arms to shield his face as the birds swarmed him. For the first time, his composure cracked. Get them off me, he shouted, his voice losing its smooth control. But the birds didn't stop. They knew him, they remembered, and they wanted him gone. Mercier stumbled backward, completely overwhelmed by the raging mass of wings and claws. The birds showed no mercy. They struck at his arms, his legs, any exposed skin they could reach. His coat was ripped in several places, and thin lines of blood appeared on his hands as he tried to shield his face. Help me, he screamed. But no one moved. Michael's hands clenched into fists. He should do something. But what? Mercier was dangerous. He wasn't just some traveler caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was the reason they were in this mess. And yet, as he watched the birds tear into the man, a part of him hesitated. Michael turned to the old woman. What's in that box? She didn't answer. Her grip on it tightened. Luis stepped forward, lowering his voice. Lady, we don't have time for secrets. If you know something. A loud snap interrupted him. Mercier had fallen. One of his legs had twisted under him. And as he collapsed onto the gravel, his back slammed against a rock. Michael took an instinctive step forward. Mercier. Then he saw what had fallen out of the man's coat. It wasn't a gun. It was a small black device. A remote, with a single red button. Michael's blood ran cold. He knew what that meant. Mercier wasn't just here for the box. He had a backup plan. For a split second, no one moved. The only sound was the furious beating of wings, the sharp cries of the birds, and Mercier's ragged breathing as he lay sprawled on the ground. Then, Mercier's fingers twitched. Michael's eyes locked onto the remote. That button, whatever it did, Mercier was still determined to press it. No time to think. Michael lunged forward. So did Mercier. The two men collided, the force of the movement sending them both rolling across the rocky ground. Michael barely had time to register the pain as sharp gravel scraped his arms. His only focus was Mercier's hand, which was still gripping the device. "Let it go," Michael growled, struggling to pry Mercier's fingers off the remote. Mercier gritted his teeth. "You don't know what you're doing." Michael tightened his grip around Mercier's wrist. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" A dark, humorless chuckle escaped Mercier's lips. "All right," he panted. "You want to know what happens if I press this?" He gave Michael a cruel grin. "Go ahead, try me." Michael hesitated. That moment of doubt was all Mercier needed. With a sudden twist, he broke free. And then, his thumb slammed down on the button. Click. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a sharp, high-pitched whine pierced the air. Michael froze. His instincts screamed danger, but he had no idea what Mercier had just activated. Then the reaction started. The birds, every single one of them, suddenly shrank back. Their furious attacks halting all at once. It was as if something invisible had struck them. Their wings twitched, their heads jerked, and then, they scattered. The cloud of black feathers broke apart, fleeing into the sky in every direction. For the first time since this nightmare began, the bus was silent. Michael's breath came in sharp gasps as he looked at Mercier, who was now smirking. He knew this would happen. Michael lunged for the device again. "What did you just do?" Mercier didn't resist. He simply let go of the remote. "I stopped them." Michael's grip tightened around the small device. The screen on the side blinked rapidly before turning off. A signal. A frequency. Michael's stomach twisted. "You were controlling them," he whispered. Mercier's smirk widened. "More like, influencing them." Luis stepped closer, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're telling me you had a way to make them attack? And to make them stop?" Mercier stretched his arms casually, as if shaking off the pain from his injuries. "I don't make them do anything. But they respond." Michael's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just bad luck. This entire attack had been intentional. The birds had been manipulated. And Mercier was behind it all. Michael tightened his grip on the device, his mind racing. The birds had been under Mercier's influence this entire time. But there was one thing that still didn't add up. Why did they attack him earlier? If he could control them, if he could send them after the bus, then why had they turned against him? Michael glanced at the old woman, still clutching her small bag protectively. The feather. His eyes flicked back to Mercier. "You lost control," Michael said, realization dawning. Mercier stiffened. Michael took a step closer, holding up the device. "You were manipulating them with this, weren't you? Using some kind of signal?" Mercier didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. Luis exhaled sharply. "But they attacked you. That doesn't make sense." Michael's mind pieced it together. "Something disrupted your signal." He looked at the old woman again. She had been holding onto that feather the entire time. Michael turned back to Mercier. "What was it?" Mercier hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "A mistake." Michael narrowed his eyes. "What kind of mistake?" Mercier sighed and gestured at the old woman's bag. "That feather. It's not just any feather. It came from a bird that, well, let's just say it doesn't exist in the wild anymore." A chill ran down Michael's spine. Luis frowned. "What does that mean?" Mercier gave a tight smile. "It means, the birds recognized something. Something they weren't supposed to recognize." Michael glanced at the old woman, who was now gripping her bag even tighter. And suddenly, he understood. The birds had attacked because of that feather. Because it belonged to something they feared, or something they revered. And Mercier had no control over that. For the first time, Michael saw something new in Mercier's eyes. Unease. Because if even he didn't fully understand the bird's reaction, then what else had he underestimated? Michael's patience was wearing thin. He was tired, frustrated, and still shaken from the attack. He stepped closer to Mercier. "No more games. Explain it, now." Mercier hesitated, but the intensity in Michael's voice left no room for evasion. He sighed. "All right, you want the truth? Here it is." He pointed at the old woman's bag. "That feather, it's from the imperial eagle. A rare subspecies that was thought to be extinct. But it's not." Michael frowned. "And why does that matter?" Mercier exhaled. "Because these birds, the ones that attacked us, belong to the same ecosystem. Their species has a deeply ingrained response to the imperial eagle. It's their top predator. The sight, smell, or even the presence of a feather can trigger extreme reactions." Luis shook his head in disbelief. "Wait, so you're saying, they saw that feather and panicked?" Mercier nodded. "Exactly. My signal keeps them under control. But when they detected that feather, their instinct took over. It disrupted everything." Michael turned to the old woman. She was holding the bag even tighter now. Her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Where did you get that feather?" Michael asked her, his voice softer now. The woman hesitated, then finally spoke. "My son, he's a researcher. He studies birds. He found this feather in a remote forest and sent it to me. Said it was special. I always keep it with me." Michael exhaled slowly. This wasn't just any feather, it was proof that a supposedly extinct bird was still alive. And Mercier had known about it. Michael turned back to him. "You were trying to capture these birds, weren't you?" Mercier didn't deny it. He simply shrugged. "Capture? No. Study? Yes. But let's be real, Michael. People would pay a fortune for proof that a lost species still exists." Michael clenched his jaw. "You caused all of this. You put everyone in danger, just for money." Mercier smiled faintly. "Not just money. Knowledge. Control." Michael took a deep breath. "They needed to get out of here, now. We're done talking," he said firmly. "Luis, let's get the passengers back on the bus. We're leaving." But just as they turned to go, a new sound reached their ears. A deep, echoing bird call. Michael felt the hair on his arms stand up. It wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from somewhere deep in the mountains. And this time, it wasn't just a flock of small birds reacting. Something much bigger had just answered the call. The deep, echoing bird call sent a chill down Michael's spine. It wasn't like the chaotic screeching of the smaller birds that had attacked earlier. This sound was deliberate, powerful, a warning. Everyone fell silent. Luis swallowed hard. That didn't come from the flock, did it? Mercier, for the first time, looked genuinely uneasy. He turned his head toward the distant ridges of the mountain, scanning the rocky cliffs and dense trees. Michael's grip on the bus door tightened. "What was that?" Mercier exhaled. "If I had to guess? That was an imperial eagle." The air felt heavier. "But, I thought they were extinct?" Luis said, looking at the old woman. She shook her head slowly. "Not extinct, just unseen." Michael's thoughts raced. If an imperial eagle really was out there, it meant that the flock's aggressive behavior wasn't just instinct, it was response to an actual presence. Which meant the situation was about to get even worse. "We need to leave, now." Michael's voice was firm. Luis nodded and turned toward the passengers. "All right, everyone, back on the bus. We're moving." The group hurried inside, still shaken but eager to get out of the open. As Michael stepped up to the driver's seat, Mercier grabbed his arm. "Wait." Michael yanked his arm away. "What now?" Mercier kept his voice low. "We might have a problem." Michael shot him an incredulous look. "You think?" Mercier ignored the sarcasm. "If that really was an imperial eagle, then it's watching us. And if it sees us as a threat to its territory." A sudden, sharp shadow swept across the windshield. Michael barely had time to react before the roar of massive wings filled the air above them. A giant dark shape passed overhead, circling once before vanishing behind the ridgeline. Then, another piercing cry rang out, this time much closer. Michael gritted his teeth. "That's it, we're getting out of here." He slammed the door shut and shifted the bus into gear. But before he could move, something landed hard on the roof. The entire bus shook. Passengers gasped. And outside the windshield, perched on the rocky outcrop just ahead of them, the imperial eagle finally revealed itself. It was massive, easily over a meter tall. Its wings partially spread, golden-brown feathers glinting under the late afternoon sun. Its sharp eyes were locked onto the bus, watching, waiting, and behind it, high in the cliffs, something moved. Michael's hands were clammy against the steering wheel. The massive eagle perched on the rock in front of them was like something out of a nature documentary, except this wasn't a screen. It was real. The passengers in the bus sat frozen, barely breathing. Luis whispered, "What do we do?" Mercier, still staring at the eagle, muttered, "We wait." Michael shot him an incredulous look. "Wait? For what?" Mercier didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the bird, watching its movements carefully. If we moved too fast, it might attack. Michael exhaled sharply. That thing is huge. If it wanted to attack, it already would have. The eagle suddenly ruffled its feathers and let out a deep, low call. The sound reverberated through the canyon. Then, something shifted in the distance. Michael's gaze snapped to the high cliffs behind the eagle. There, barely visible, was a nest. A massive one. And in that nest, there were chicks. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "This isn't about us," he muttered. Mercier nodded slowly. "It's protecting its young." Luis exhaled. "So, what? We just wait for it to let us go?" Michael's mind raced. The adult eagle wasn't attacking yet, but it wasn't letting them move either. "We need to show it we're not a threat," he said finally. Mercier raised an eyebrow. "And how do you suggest we do that?" Michael turned to the old woman. "The feather," he said. Her eyes widened. "Are you sure?" she asked. Michael had no idea if he was sure, but it was the only thing he could think of. Slowly, carefully, the old woman reached into her bag and pulled out the golden feather once more. The eagle's sharp eyes flickered toward it immediately. And then, it hopped down from the rock. Passengers gasped. The giant bird approached the bus, step by step, its talons gripping the rocky ground. Michael held his breath as the eagle came right up to the windshield. And then, it stopped, its piercing eyes locked onto the feather in the old woman's hands. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, to everyone's shock, the eagle lowered its head. Michael could barely breathe. The eagle remained still, its golden eyes fixed on the feather in the old woman's hands. Then, slowly, it let out a deep, low cry, not aggressive, but almost recognizing. The tension in the air was suffocating. Michael whispered, "What is happening?" The old woman, her voice steady, finally spoke the truth. "This feather does not belong to just any bird," she said. Michael's brow furrowed. "Then what?" "It came from an eagle. One just like this." A hushed silence fell over the bus. Luis frowned. "So you mean, this eagle thinks we have something of its own?" The old woman nodded. "Or, at the very least, it recognizes it." Mercier exhaled sharply. "And what does that mean for us?" Michael was already thinking, if the feather truly belonged to an eagle of the same species, then perhaps. He stepped forward. "Give it back," he said. The old woman hesitated for a moment but then extended her hands. Slowly, cautiously, the eagle's eyes followed the motion. And then, swiftly, with incredible precision, it snatched the feather from her grasp. Gasps filled the bus. Some passengers flinched, but the eagle did nothing more. It held the feather in its beak for a moment, then spread its massive wings, and launched into the air. The sudden gust of wind sent dust flying around them. The eagle soared upward, carrying the golden feather with it. Michael watched in awe as it flew toward the high cliffs, toward the nest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a miracle. The other birds, the thousands of them, began to retreat. One by one, the crows, the hawks, the smaller birds that had blocked the road took flight. Following the eagle's lead, the sky, once filled with chaos, slowly cleared. Luis let out a breath he had been holding. "No way." Mercier shook his head in disbelief. "It worked." Michael, exhausted but relieved, slumped back into his seat. The road was open once more. "Let's get out of here," he murmured. And with that, the bus moved forward again, leaving behind the mountains, the birds, and the mystery of the golden feather, one that no one would ever fully understand. As the bus rolled forward, Michael felt relief finally settle in. The birds had disappeared, the road was clear, and soon they would leave the mountains behind. But something still didn't feel right. His eyes flicked to Mercier, who had remained silent ever since the eagle took the feather. The man sat stiffly, his gaze fixed outside the window, watching the cliffs fade into the distance. Michael frowned. "Something on your mind?" Mercier hesitated before shaking his head. "No," but his fingers were tightly clenched. "Luis," who had been watching him too, muttered, "You sure? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mercier exhaled sharply. "Not a ghost," he said, "just something I hoped I'd never see again." Michael and Luis exchanged a look. "Again?" Michael asked cautiously. Mercier's lips pressed into a thin line. This isn't the first time I've seen birds act like that." Michael's heart skipped a beat. "You mean?" Mercier nodded. "It was years ago. I was still working on environmental projects back then, wildlife monitoring. We were stationed near a reserve, tracking migratory patterns of raptors." Luis leaned in, and Mercier's expression darkened. "One day, the birds turned violent." Michael held his breath. "It wasn't natural," Mercier continued. "They weren't just scared or defensive. It was as if they were reacting to something they didn't like. We lost a researcher that day. They attacked her car on a bridge. She lost control and..." His voice trailed off. A heavy silence settled between them. Michael gripped the wheel tighter. Luis whispered, "And you think this is the same thing?" Mercier didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered toward the sky, as if searching for something still watching them. Then, softly, he said, "I don't think it's the same." He looked at Michael. "I know it is." And with that, the truth hung in the air, unspoken, undeniable. No one said another word. The bus moved on, carrying them toward civilization, toward safety. But deep down, Michael knew that Mercier had seen something he would never tell them. And whatever it was, it hadn't ended yet. Days passed. The incident with the birds made its way into local news. But like all strange occurrences, it was soon dismissed, a mystery with no answer. For most of the passengers, it became nothing more than a strange story to tell at family dinners, a thrilling memory. But nothing more. But not for Mercier. Michael found him a few days later, standing at the edge of the bus depot, staring at the horizon. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Michael asked. Mercier didn't deny it. "There's more to this," he murmured. "More than we understand." Michael crossed his arms. "And you think you're going to find the answer?" Mercier gave him a small, tired smile. "I don't know, but I had to try." Luis appeared, shaking his head. "Man, you just survived an attack by thousands of birds. And now you're walking straight back into that mess?" Mercier shrugged. "It's not the first time. Won't be the last." Michael exhaled, watching his friend adjust his bag. "Where will you go?" Mercier glanced up at the sky, as if searching for something only he could see. "Wherever the birds lead me." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the vast, open road. Michael and Luis stood in silence, watching him go. "Think we'll ever see him again?" Luis asked. Michael didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Maybe, but I don't think he'll ever stay." And as the wind carried the distant cry of a bird overhead, Michael realized, some people are just meant to keep moving. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey. We hope you enjoyed the story and felt the suspense unfold with every twist and turn. If you love gripping stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us bring more exciting content your way. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think. See you in the next adventure.